It's fascinating how sometimes, in the world of business and agreements, the weight of everything can hinge on the smallest detail.
Absolutely. One tiny mark on a page, a single initial maybe tucked away in a document you thought was completely settled.
Right. One moment you believe a chapter is closed, a deal is done, sealed with a handshake and all the paperwork. And the next, that one tiny detail just throws everything into chaos.
Well, agreements certainly rely on a foundation of trust, but ultimately, yeah, their definition lies in the written word. And every single element on that page, every mark, can potentially become the focal point of a major dispute.
And that brings us right to the heart of our deep dive today. We're exploring claims from a former franchisee regarding, well, a termination agreement, a business sale, and some seriously disputed initials.
Yeah, our look into this story is drawn from excerpts of material titled Forged Initials, Disputed Accounts, and Muhammad Khan's Pizza Franchise Exit.
Okay, so let's unpack what these sources report. Our mission here is really to understand the key events the allegations presented, focusing on the story that reportedly unfolded after what seemed like a completed transaction. So, based on the material, how did Muhammad Khan reportedly see his situation as he was exiting his franchise?
Well, according to the source material, Muhammad Khan, who had been a Gino's Pizza franchisee, believed he had finalized everything. He saw it as a done deal, an exit through a buyback agreement.
He reportedly felt completely finished with that part of his life, like close the book.
That's the picture painted, yes. But then the reports indicate that just weeks later, Muhammad claims he made a pretty significant and unexpected discovery.
Okay, tell us about that discovery. What did he reportedly find?
He says he found a version of that termination agreement, the document meant to finalize his exit. That included language he states he had explicitly rejected during the negotiations leading up to the handover.
And what was this contentious language? What did it actually say?
This version reportedly contained a clause intended to release the franchisor from any future legal claims by him, which, is key.
Yeah, that's a big deal. Waiving legal rights is a major point in any negotiation like this.
Exactly.
And where does the detail about the initials come in?
So according to his claims, sitting right beside that specific clause on page 2 of this document were initials that looked like his.
Looks like his, but what's his reported stance on them? Does he say they're his?
No, Muhammad is reportedly absolutely adamant that those initials are not his. The sources really emphasize his perspective on this.
Okay.
They state he'd spent hours in a meeting right before the handover and was reportedly crystal clear that he would not agree to waive his right to potential legal action later on.
So he was very specific about that point.
Very specific, according to the reports. He maintains that this specific release clause was never part of the agreement he thought they had finalized and signed off on.
So you have this fundamental conflict right there. A reported clear understanding during the talks versus a document found later with a key rejected clause and disputed initials next to it. This immediately flags a crucial point for anyone involved in agreements. The authenticity of every mark, every initial on the final paper can be paramount, potentially overriding whatever was discussed before.
Absolutely. What was the reported immediate fallout from this discovery? It must have been quite a shock.
Well, the situation instantly raises the potential for a complete breakdown of trust. Right.
You'd think so.
It moves the whole scenario from just, a standard business transaction into a space requiring serious legal scrutiny.
Okay, so his lawyer got involved. What did their first communication reportedly cover? Was it just about those disputed initials?
The sources indicate there were two key issues flagged right away. One certainly was the presence of those disputed initials next to that contentious release clause. That was reported as a major concern.
Oh, like what kind of accounts?
Specifically, TD Merchant and Uber Eats accounts are mentioned in the sources.
Okay, important operational accounts.
Wow. Okay, that sounds like a recipe for a significant problem, a huge headache.
It certainly does. And Muhammad is quoted in the sources stating, this wasn't just some minor technicality. He reportedly found himself personally liable for chargebacks and returns. On a business he didn't even own or operate anymore.
On a business he had already sold, that he thought he was finished with.
Oh, no. According to his claims, yes. All because of this reported situation with the accounts not being handled correctly, allegedly, by the buyer.
And suddenly, he's facing personal liability for a business he sold. Apparently,
that's the reported situation.
This really drives home a crucial point for anyone exiting a business. Your liability doesn't necessarily just vanish because you sign the papers, especially if the handover of assets or, the validity of the exit agreement itself is in question.
It certainly highlights that potential domino effect. When complex handovers aren't executed perfectly, and the foundational agreements themselves are called into question like this, it can create a real chain reaction of problems.
And according to the sources, Mohammed reportedly didn't just let this sit. He apparently took formal action. Correct?
That's right. On July 8th, he reportedly sent a formal notice declaring the termination agreement null and void based on these discoveries and the claims he was making.
Null and void, that's strong language.
It is. And the sources indicate he reportedly made it clear he intended to pursue legal remedies if the situation wasn't resolved.
Okay.
The material quotes the notice, stating something along the lines of, "Failure to comply with this notice and cooperate during the transition may result in further legal consequences."
Wow. That definitely marks a dramatic shift. What he thought was a finished business sale suddenly appears, based on these reports, to have escalated into a serious potential legal fight.
Yeah, all centered on questions of documentation, identity, consent, as the sources describe it. It really underscores that critical need for verification of every single detail, even after you think negotiations are done.
Absolutely. Now, the sources mention attempts at communication before that formal notice, right, to get clarity on these issues.
Yes, they do. The sources mention ongoing communication, specifically emails reportedly dated June 24th, June 27th, and July 4th, seeking clarification.
And what exactly was he seeking clarification on in those emails?
According to the reports, he wanted to know, quite simply, how those disputed initials appeared on that document with the release clause.
Okay, the origin of the initials.
Yes, and crucially, who approved that specific version of the agreement, the one containing the clause Mohammed insists he rejected?
Those seem like pretty fundamental questions if you're challenging the validity of an agreement. You'd want answers to those.
Absolutely.
And according to the sources, what kind of response did Mohammed and his lawyer reportedly receive to these specific questions?
Well, this is significant. The sources state that as of the time the material was recorded, they reportedly hadn't received any official response addressing those specific questions.
Nothing at all.
Nothing reported about the initials, nothing about who approved that particular version of the agreement.
That reported silence, especially on something so central to the challenge of a document's validity.
Yeah.
Well, it must have been incredibly frustrating.
You can imagine so.
It raises another important point, doesn't it? How crucial clear and direct communication is when disputes like this arise, particularly when you're challenging the very integrity of an agreement.
It appears so. The reported lack of clarification and resolution through direct communication seems to have solidified the decision that the matter would have to be pursued legally.
So, drawing from the source material we've been exploring in this deep dive, this story doesn't just end with unanswered questions and formal notices. According to the sources, Mohammed Khan reportedly decided to escalate things.
Yes, by pursuing legal action. That's the direction indicated in the material we reviewed.
Okay. And it's probably important as we wrap up to quickly summarize the key points we've drawn from this story, just as presented in the sources.
Good idea. So first, we looked at Mohammed's claim of discovering a version of the termination agreement with that release clause he states he explicitly rejected during negotiation.
Right, the clause he said no to.
And then the appearance of those disputed initials right next to that clause on the document he found later.
No.
Then there were the subsequent claims detailed in the sources, including those issues with business account transfers linked to the original sale.
Right, the ones involving the buyer.
Yes, reportedly leading to potential personal liability for him, like those chargebacks on a business he'd already sold.
Okay, got it. And his lawyers reported attempts to get clarification from the franchisor about those disputed initials, and crucially, who approved that specific version of the agreement.
And finally, the reported lack of any official response from the franchisor to those specific questions, at least as detailed in the source material available at that time.
Right. And it is absolutely crucial, and we need to state this clearly, just as the sources themselves do. These are the claims being made by Mohammed Khan.
Absolutely critical context, yes. These matters are reportedly currently under legal review, and importantly, no court has made any ruling on them.
That's key. The franchisor has not been found liable for forgery, fraud, or breach in connection with any of these specific claims.
Correct. That's the status reported in the sources.
So, considering the complexities laid out in this story from the sources, The dispute over initials, challenging an agreement's validity itself, those really tricky issues with account handovers and potential post-sale liability